$25 million, I sold it a long time ago. The words landed like a slap, slicing through the clinking of glasses and low murmur of conversation. Matisse stood at the center of the table, his wine glass raised high, wearing the easy grin of a man convinced he had done something brilliant. I felt the room tilt. The it he spoke of wasn't just land, it was my vineyard, my home. The legacy Edrin and I had built row by row over 40 years. Sorenia, seated beside him, leaned back in her chair, one hand draped over his arm. A slow, knowing smirk curled her lips, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. I forced my fork to the plate, the silver tines meeting china with a muted clink. You sold it. I kept my tone steady, though my fingers tightened in my lap. Mathis's smile didn't falter. It was the right move. Mother, time to let go of old burdens. Old burdens. That's what he called the vines I'd nursed through drought and flood, the soil I'd walked barefoot in every spring, the home where I'd raised him and his brother. A ripple of discomfort moved around the table. Some glanced at me, others at their plates, unsure which direction to look. I studied my son's face, searching for a glimmer of humor, a trace that this was some ill-timed joke. But there was only the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. I lifted my own glass out of reflex, but the wine barely touched my lips. My thoughts were already pulling away from the table, from the polite smiles, from the pretense of family. If his words were true, then somewhere, somehow, my name had been signed away without my hand ever touching the pen. The next morning, I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when the phone rang. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in months, Harold Kane, an old friend and the branch manager at the bank I'd trusted since before Matisse was born. Maribel, he began, his tone careful. I just need to confirm something. Did you approve the transfer of the vineyard sale proceeds to an account overseas? The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. No, Harold, I never approved any transfer, because I never sold the vineyard. He hesitated. That's what I thought. But the file says otherwise. It includes a medical assessment stating you're legally incapacitated and a power of attorney naming Mathis as your sole representative. Both have your signature. I gripped the edge of the counter. Email them to me. Right now. The documents arrived within minutes. I opened them slowly, bracing myself. The so-called medical report claimed I had advanced cognitive decline, issued by a clinic in Nevada I'd never visited. The power of attorney was neatly typed, my name beneath a signature that looked almost but not quite like mine. The loops, the tilt, the pressure all wrong. A forgery polished enough to fool anyone who didn't know my hand. I could hear Harold's voice again. If this escrow closes, there's no undoing it without a long, ugly fight. I thanked him. Though the words caught in my throat, my mind was already replaying Mathis's smug toast, the way Sorenia's eyes had flicked to me like she was savoring a private victory. Closing the laptop, I let my hands rest flat against its lid, steadying my breath. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a full-scale theft of my life, wrapped in legal paper and signed in my stolen name. And if they thought I would go quietly, they didn't know me at all. By the end of that week, every attempt to reach Hugo ended the same way, one ring. Then the call cut off. His email bounced back with an auto-reply claiming his account was no longer in use. When I asked Mathis if he'd spoken to his brother, he smiled faintly and said, "He's busy. You should focus on resting." Mother. The words sounded benign, but the look behind them was a locked door. Sorenia became the gatekeeper of my days. She started scheduling my errands, claiming she didn't want me to be tired. Visitors were told I wasn't feeling well. Even Rosa, The gardener who'd worked with us for over 15 years was turned away at the gate without warning. I walked through my own home as though it belonged to someone else. The rooms were the same, but the air was different, heavy, monitored. Conversations in the hallway hushed when I appeared. Doors closed a beat too quickly. The vineyard, once my sanctuary, now felt like an exhibit I could only view from a distance. One afternoon, I tried to drive into town for groceries. The car keys were missing from their hook when I asked. Serenia laughed lightly and said, "Oh, I put them somewhere safe. You don't need to worry about driving." That night, I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. I could hear them talking in the den, Matis's low voice, Serenia's higher one, the occasional laugh. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. Every sound told me they were confident, certain they'd built a cage I wouldn't see until it was too late. I took a slow breath and let it settle in my chest. If they thought this isolation would weaken me, they'd underestimated the woman who had weathered 40 years of harvests, storms, and droughts. Some roots grow stronger in the dark. It was late afternoon when the driveway fell silent. Matis and Serenia had left not 15 minutes earlier, their voices still echoing faintly in my mind from the sharp exchange we'd had over lunch. I knew they wouldn't be back for at least an hour. They had a meeting in town, as Serenia called it. With that air of self-importance she wore like perfume. That was when I heard the doorbell. Unannounced visitors had become almost impossible these days. But when I peeked through the curtain, I saw Lydia Harcourt standing on the porch. Her expression sharp and unreadable, a thick leather portfolio tucked under her arm. I pulled the door open quickly, glancing toward the driveway to be sure no car was turning back. "Come in quickly," I said. "You've been set up," she said plainly. She slid the first page toward me, the forged medical evaluation I'd already seen. Now, alongside a notarized power of attorney in Mathis's name, beneath it, a preliminary sale agreement for the vineyard dated weeks before that family luncheon. I traced a finger over the paper, feeling the weight of each lie. "How did you get these?" A colleague at the county recorder's office flagged them. She replied, "I've already filed a temporary hold on the sale. It's not permanent, but it buys us a little time." Her eyes held mine. "Once the escrow closes, undoing this will take years and cost you more than you want to imagine. We need evidence enough to prove deliberate fraud." The word fraud hung in the air between us, heavy and clarifying. I nodded slowly. "Then we get it." She leaned back, assessing me. "They think you're isolated, cornered. Let them keep thinking that. It'll make them careless." The plan began to form right there. Between the two of us and a cooling pot of tea, I would play the role they'd scripted for me, the distracted, weary woman, too trusting to see the knife in her back. And while they believed their performance was flawless, I'd be building mine by the time Lydia left. The first outlines of a trap were already taking shape in my mind. 2 mornings later, I invited Matis and Serenia for tea in the garden. The vines stretched in neat rows around us, leaves whispering in the late summer breeze. I wore my softest cardigan, the one that always made me look smaller somehow, and moved slowly, as though fatigue had settled into my bones. I let the conversation drift before leaning forward with a faint smile. "I've been thinking about what you said, about selling. Maybe you could explain it again, so I understand all the benefits." Mathis's eyes lit with triumph. The way a man looks when he believes the battle is already won. "Of course. The buyer's based in Zurich. International money. No taxes here. No headaches. You'd have a comfortable allowance, and the rest, well, we'd invest it." Zurich. The word caught like a burr in my mind. I hadn't seen it in any of the forged paperwork Harold sent me. That detail was new and valuable. Serenia sipped her tea, her tone light. It's a chance to move on. Maribel, you can finally rest. I nodded faintly, letting my gaze drop as if in thought. Inside the pocket of my cardigan, a small digital recorder hummed to life, catching every word. They spoke freely for nearly 20 minutes, outlining their plans as though I were already a footnote. A Manhattan apartment, a portfolio in Matis's name, liquidating the old place, as they called it, before the market turns. When the teapot was empty, I thanked them softly and watched them walk back toward the house, their voices carrying with the breeze. That evening, I slipped into Edrin's old study, lifted the loose floorboard beneath the desk, and slid the recorder into the hidden space we'd once used for spare keys and emergency cash. It wasn't much yet, but it was the first real thread I could pull. The next day, Lydia filed a petition to freeze the escrow account, citing suspected fraud. It wasn't a guaranteed win, but it was enough to stall the process and keep the money from disappearing overnight. In the meantime, she had been digging. Late one evening, she called with the kind of news that sharpens your focus instantly, the medical evaluation naming you incompetent. It came from a clinic in Reno, except that clinic shut down 3 years ago. The physician who supposedly signed it died last winter. I gripped the phone tighter. So they fabricated the whole thing, fabricated and laundered it through someone they knew. She said, "The signature on the report belongs to a man who happens to be Serenia's cousin." The walls of my home seemed to press in a little closer. Every hallway, every quiet room, felt like it had ears. I knew I couldn't let them see even a crack in my composure, so I made myself smaller. I forgot little things on purpose, the name of a wine, the day of the week just enough to feed the story they'd built. Matis began to talk more freely, slipping in details about the buyer's timeline and keeping Hugo in the dark until after closing. Each word was a bead on a string I was threading together, one that would eventually form a noose around their plan. Lydia and I managed to meet twice that week, both times here, at the vineyard. When Matis and Serenia were away on errands, we kept to the old study at the back of the house, the one they rarely entered, its door closed and curtains drawn, away from their eyes and ears. We compared notes, her legal strategy, and my growing collection of recordings. She told me the DA's office already had a financial crimes investigator reviewing every forged document and transaction. The net was tightening, but so was the deadline. Each meeting ended the same way, Lydia, slipping out quietly, leaving me with the sound of the gravel drive settling back into silence. By Friday afternoon, after our second meeting, I knew the next step had to come from me, something bold enough to make them believe I was ready to hand it all over. On Sunday morning, I found Matis in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone while Serenia measured coffee into the press. I stepped in quietly, my hands clasped in front of me, and let a small, practiced sigh escape. "I've been thinking," I began, letting my voice waver just enough. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to sell." Matis looked up sharply, a smile spreading before he could hide it. "That's a wise decision, Mother. You won't regret it." Serenia's eyes glittered. "We can set up a meeting with the buyer's representative this week. You'll only need to sign a few things, nothing complicated." I nodded, as if relieved. "Good. I want to make sure you two aren't burdened anymore. You've done so much already." The flattery landed exactly where I wanted it. Matis leaned back, his shoulders relaxing. He started talking about a closing lunch, a celebration before the documents were finalized. I listened, nodding at the right places, while committing every word to memory. That evening, I called Lydia. "They think I'm ready. There will be a meeting and a lunch. Perfect, she said. We'll have the recorder ready. Just keep them talking. Don't push. Let them brag. I could hear the quiet confidence in her voice, the assurance of someone who had cornered bigger predators before. We agreed on the plan. Step by careful step. By the time I hung up, the stage was set. All that remained was to play my part so well that they never saw the trap closing until it was too late. The restaurant they chose was all polished wood and white linen, the kind of place Matisse always picked when he wanted to impress someone. We were shown to a corner table, away from the main crowd, where the sunlight spilled in through tall windows. I wore my soft gray dress, the one that looked a little worn at the cuffs, and let my shoulders slump just enough to suggest fatigue. They ordered champagne before we'd even opened the menus. To new beginnings, Matisse said, raising his glass. Serenia's smile was all teeth. I returned the toast, letting the bubbles brush my lips, but not drinking much. Tell me again, I said lightly, how this will all work. I want to be able to explain it properly when people ask. That was all the prompting they needed. Matisse launched into the timeline, the buyer's representative arriving from Zurich. The transfer scheduled within 48 hours. The escrow release once the final signatures were collected. Serenia added her own flourishes. Speaking of the Manhattan apartment they'd already put a deposit on, the trips they'd take once the vineyard was liquidated. Her voice held the unguarded thrill of someone convinced the prize was already theirs. The recorder, hidden in the lining of my handbag, caught every word. I nodded, asked small questions, even laughed once when Matisse joked about how Hugo will find out in the papers. By the time dessert arrived, they were relaxed, leaning back in their chairs. The deal all but signed in their minds. I excused myself to the restroom, where I texted Lydia a single word, done. When I returned, we lingered a few more minutes over coffee before parting ways in the parking lot. Matisse kissed my cheek, his confidence radiating like heat off the asphalt. I drove home slowly, the recorder secure, my mind already shifting to the next morning when their celebration would turn to ash. At dawn, the air over the vineyard was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of ripening grapes. I was in the kitchen, tying the last piece of twine around the small gift box, honey, lavender, and the note when the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached my ears. I stepped into the hallway just as Matisse emerged from the den in his robe, Serenia following in her silk dressing gown. "What's going on?" he asked, brow furrowed. "I wanted to give you something before things change," I said, holding out the box. Serenia's eyes narrowed in suspicion, but she took it from my hands. She opened the lid, glanced at the honey, the lavender, then read the note inside. Her expression faltered. The moment hung between us for only a heartbeat before a firm knock rattled the front door. I opened it to find 2 detectives on the porch, badges in full view, Matisse, Bramwell, Serenia. Bramwell, the lead detective, said evenly, "We have a warrant for your arrest." Matisse spun toward me, his voice sharp. "What is this?" Before I could answer, Lydia stepped forward from behind the detectives, the folded warrant in her hand. "It's the end of your scheme," she said calmly. Serenia's smirk collapsed entirely, her knuckles whitening as she clutched the box. The detectives entered, reading the charges aloud: fraud, forgery, elder financial abuse. Each word landed heavy in the stillness of the house. The click of the handcuffs was final. Matisse tried to speak, but the officers guided him firmly toward the door. Serenia followed, her silk robe brushing the floor, the gift box still pressed against her side like a useless shield as they stepped outside into the waiting morning light. I turned to Lydia and said, "Let's start putting my home back in order." The vineyard felt different that afternoon, not because the vines had changed, but because the weight pressing on me, was finally gone. Lydia stayed long enough to go over the formalities restitution agreements, the court schedule, and the assurance that the temporary hold had been replaced by a permanent block against any unauthorized sale. When she left, I walked the rows alone, letting my hand trail over the leaves. The soil was warm beneath my shoes. The same earth Edrin and I had turned together decades ago. It had survived droughts, floods, pests, and now it had survived betrayal. News of the arrest spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors stopped by with quiet words, some with casseroles, others with nothing but a clasp of my hand. I accepted it all with gratitude, but without the need to explain more than I wished. That evening, Hugo arrived. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew enough. We stood on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. The sky stained gold and rose. "You kept it," he said simply. "I did," I replied, feeling the truth of it in my bones. Later, I walked to the guest house at the edge of the property, a place that had once been for visiting friends but had sat unused for years. I unlocked the door, breathing in the faint scent of cedar, and imagined the women who might find safety here, women whose families had tried to strip them of everything, just as mine had. The idea had been forming quietly for weeks, even before the arrests. Now it had a shape, a purpose. This land wouldn't just be my refuge. It would be theirs, too. I closed the door and stood for a moment in the twilight, the hum of crickets rising from the vineyard. The storm had passed, but the roots remained deep, unshaken, and wholly mine.